Behind the Palestinian stuff is this ferocious apocalyptic scenario in which Islam takes over the world. And the target is not just Israel, the target is, in particular, Western democracies.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, Editor-in-Chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thanks for joining us. Today we have an important conversation for you about the connections between woke ideology, media bias, and anti-Semitism. But first, I want to remind you to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. I also want to remind you that you don't have to wait a full week for more Top Story analysis. There is a daily Top Story podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Top Story with Jonathan Tobin on the JNS channel on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. Also, I'd like to let you know that JNS is also on Telegram. You can find the latest news there, including Top Story and other JNS TV content, by subscribing. And now, to today's program. One of the most perplexing, as well as troubling aspects of modern Jewish life is the connection between four terrible things. One consists of the fashionable left-wing ideologies that dominate not just academia, but our popular culture, and thanks to President Joe Biden, also the government. The belief in the myth of intersectionality that claims that all conflicts are essentially the same thing, and treats the Palestinian war on Israel's existence as morally equivalent to the struggle for civil rights in the United States. And that is the sort of false conclusion that is drawn wherever critical race theory and indoctrination in the woke catechism of diversity, equity, and inclusion is spread. The second is the contempt for the West that is both a driving force in the efforts to wrongly redefine America as an irredeemably racist nation and to trash the achievements of Western civilization as tainted by racism and therefore not to be valued. This distressing trend, which has also conquered academia and much of our culture, works hand in hand with the rise of an aggressive Islamist faith and political culture in much of the Middle East, and which has spread to the West, where it has become a strange bedfellow of Western leftist elites who despise their own heritage and think Israel and the Jews are privileged white oppressors, while assuming, wrongly, that the Palestinian Arabs are oppressed people of color. Though light years apart in their outlooks, they are united by their hatred for Israel and Zionism and form a bizarre red-green alliance with the Jews as the object of their animus. The third is the spread of media bias, driven by ideologues who believe the press's job is not to report as objectively as possible, but rather to slant the news so as to advance the political agendas that they support. This leads those influenced by both left-wing ideologies and the elitist sympathy for the supposedly oppressed Arabs to treat reporting on Israel and its conflict with the Palestinians as purely an exercise in trashing the Jewish state and rationalizing and apologizing for its enemies, and their refusals to make peace, as well as their oppressive cultures. The latter, including oppression of women and gays and authoritarian governments, would, if it was the product of Westerners, be vigorously opposed, but which is instead ignored and excused. The last of the four factors is the perennial curse of anti-Semitism, which is, as the great Ruth Weiss has taught us, the most successful of all movements since it attaches itself to other ideologies such as fascism, Nazism, communism, and in our own era, Islamism and woke cultural Marxism. These four factors have combined to create a powerful movement driving hatred against Jews and Israel that, armed as it is by these disparate ideologies and using the power of the corporate media, has targeted Israel for not just unfair treatment, but for the sort of delegitimization that has led to violence and bloodshed. Against it, Jews and their allies have been hampered by the power of what scholar Richard Landis has identified as groups of anti-Zionist Jews and liberals, Western progressives, Muslim ideologues, and a dangerously biased media. The result is the current dilemma in which Israel, though it has grown and thrived in ways that few would have predicted at its birth 75 years ago, remains besieged by an international movement of hatred, and which is, at the same time, the main force driving the rising tide of anti-Semitism that is spreading across the globe. The origins of this problem and the consequences of its rise is the subject of a recently published book, Can the Whole World Be Wrong? Lethal Journalism, Anti-Semitism and Global Jihad by Richard Landis, whom we're very pleased to have with us today. Richard Landis is a scholar of medieval history who formerly taught at Boston University. He's now an independent writer and the author of Heaven on Earth, The Varieties of the Millennial Experience, which examines apocalyptic and millennial movements from ancient Egypt to global jihad. Richard Landis, welcome to Top Story.
Thank you.
Well, Richard, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking you about your own personal journey. How did a historian that studied and taught about life in the medieval era wind up devoting his life and scholarship to the study of the contemporary forces fighting against the Jews?
That's a good question. I'm not sure exactly how to answer it. I think what happened was I was a medieval historian. I chose medieval history because I think that's when the modern West begins to take shape. I consider the period from basically 1000 to 2000 to be modern, 1000 to 1500 early modern, and then modernity in the second half of the millennium. So I'm working on it, and among other things, I work mostly on Christian sources, but I'm paying attention to Jewish sources, and I find a pattern that struck me, which was that every time you see a serious outbreak of anti-Semitism, real violence against the Jews and stuff, if you go back in time, 10 years, a generation, you find a period of philo-Judaism, in which Jews are getting along quite well with Christians. The economy is developing. Jews are living, for instance, in the mid-11th century, we have letters from bishops saying, get a community of Jews, let them live by their law. That's the way to get your city off to a good start. So you have these very positive relations, and then all of a sudden this kind of explosion. And, you can see it also. The Weimar period was very philo-Judaic, and then you get the explosion of the Nazis and so on. Luther started out his career being very favorable to the Jews and then became really nasty. It was related to apocalyptic expectations because Christians, when they think Jesus is about to come back, try and convert Jews by love bombing them. And then when Jews refuse and Jesus doesn't come back, they blame the Jews for him not coming back and so on. And what happened was I started thinking, gee, I live in probably the longest period of philo-Judaism and the most intense and penetrating period of philo-Judaism on record. And I'm looking at various apocalyptic scenarios from the Christian fundamentalists, but also from the Muslims, because I had a good source on apocalyptic thought in Islam in the 90s and so on. And I go to the various Jewish organizations and say, I'm concerned because there may be an outbreak. And they tell me, don't worry, everything's fine. I went to Chief Rabbi Jonathan Zichrono Livracha, went to the ADL, the ADC, AJC, and so on. And they basically all told me, don't worry. And then when the proverbial shit hit the fan in 2000, these Jewish organizations were like deer in the headlights. They'd never expected this. They thought, we're going to support everybody else's human rights, and then if we're in trouble, we'll have allies. And in fact, all of their left-wing progressive allies turned on them in 2000 as a result of this. I was on the media committee at the AJC, and I looked into the Al-Dura case. And it was just, it was staggering what was happening. Here was this ferociously powerful blood libel being carried by the media, which was patently fake. But even if it weren't patently fake, the accusation that the IDF was targeting this kid and killed him in his father's arms is classic blood libel. It's, intentional murder of innocent Gentile children. So that's how I got involved. And I will say that as a medieval historian, I sort of stumbled across a massive case of forgery. The guy I wrote my thesis on, a historian monk named Adamar Shaban, spent the whole final 4 years of his career writing forgeries, letters from the Pope, extensive accounts of councils where the stuff he's reporting never took place and so on. So, and what struck me was that somebody had already figured that out in the 1920s and 30s. And for the next 50 years until I came along, a couple of people before me, Daniel Callahan, but by and large, before the late 70s, early 80s, nobody picked him up on this analysis of the fakes. So I think I was ready to understand that even when you can show very powerfully that something is a fake, if that fake serves a purpose in the narrative structure of your audience, they're not going to let go of it that easily. So I think of all the people who worked on Al-Dura, I was sort of the least crushed by the failure of the media to respond to the evidence that this was just a joke and that Charles Andelin had radically misled the media about his journalist and so on.
That's really fascinating, and that it stems from your own experience as a historian studying something else, and about the power of confirmation bias. The title of your recent book, "Can the Whole World Be Wrong?" is taken from a quote by the great Jewish writer as part of his efforts to explain why the world was aligned against the Jews at a time of blood libels.
Right.
Yet, as you've argued very eloquently, it is equally apt today as new blood libels are spread. Can you explain to us on one foot, as we say, how both those factors that you described as lethal journalism, anti-Semitism, and global jihad are able to combine? These are very different things to create, yet they do combine to create a dangerous world, both for Israel and the Jews.
Yeah, what the French historians would call conjoncture. So what happens is you've got, first of all, a media which is, already not that well disposed towards Israel. A sharp turn first after 1967 and then clearly after the Lebanon War of 1982 and Sabra and Shatila and stuff. So and certainly a place like CNN has a culture. Stephen Emerson was telling me yesterday that back in the 90s, the way that you rooted out the pro-Israelis is if they were even-handed, then they were pro-Israel. So you've got this media that is not that well disposed to Israel and under intense intimidation from the PLO to run their stories and to run them the way they want them told. So the lethal journalism is the journalists who are presenting Palestinian war propaganda as if it were news. And that's the case in the Jenin massacre. That's the case in Muhammad Al-Dura. That's the case over and over again every time there's a conflict between the IDF and various Palestinian terror groups, whether they're coming from the West Bank or they're coming from Gaza or Lebanon. So on the one hand, you have this sort of flood of war propaganda of the nastiest kind, really nasty stuff, pouring into the Western information news, the information flow in the West on the one hand, and then you have amongst both the journalists and amongst the audience some people who are significantly, shall we say, excited by this news of Jews behaving badly. And I have an article that's coming out shortly in the Journal of Anti-Semitism about what I call progressive supersessionism. And the point about supersessionism, whether it's early Christian or Muslim or Enlightenment or whatever, is that you're in competition with the Jews. You are the chosen people, not the Jews.
Could you define supersessionism? For everybody in the audience who may not know what that means.
Supersessionism or replacement theology is basically the doctrine that first got worked out in the first century by the Christians, which said we are the chosen and the Jews have been unchosen. It's a very zero-sum notion of what chosen is. They couldn't say we too are chosen. They had to say, no, we're chosen and you're unchosen. And once you make that zero-sum choice, you're stuck in a dynamic that my father repeatedly told me was not a good thing, which is the idea that you make yourself look bigger by making other people look smaller, and particularly making the Jews look smaller. And I think that's one of the great appeals of lethal journalism, is that it somehow reassures the progressives that they are the only true moral voice on the planet, and that the Jews are in fact not competitors or even allies, again, terribly zero-sum attitudes, but that they must be sort of the opposite. And the worse they look, the better. We may not look better, but we feel that we look better. So you've got those two things. And then behind the Palestinian stuff is this ferocious apocalyptic scenario in which Islam takes over the world. And the target is not just Israel. The target is, in particular, Western democracies. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other targets in Indonesia and Nigeria and stuff. The jihadis are at work. But the idea is that you've got a movement. It doesn't represent Islam, although it certainly has roots deep in Islamic thought, that believes that now is the time for a global caliphate, which is why I call them the caliphators. And people who believe that, among other things, are huge supporters of the Palestinians, and the Palestinians are using the sort of genocidal, apocalyptic, paranoid discourse that feeds global jihad, whether it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda or whatever, or the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah. Now, in your book, you begin your narrative with a retelling of the hoax surrounding the alleged murder of a Palestinian child, Mohammed Al-Dura, by Israeli forces, which you've already mentioned, and that happened at the start of the Second Intifada. Though those events are now more than 20 years in the past, time flies, right? But why is that story and the tale of how biased media spread a lie that was so persuasive that even many in Israel were ready to believe it, or the IDF? Why is it still important? And I guess part of the answer is because, why are critics of Israel still talking about this idea of Palestinian children being targeted?
Right. I mean, what happened was that story introduced as a believable meme the idea that the IDF targeted children. Until then, the Palestinians have been claiming all the time the IDF targeted children, but there was no evidence, and it was just treated as a Palestinian exaggeration. Once that happened, the press was ready to run anything the Palestinians claimed. So what we have today is people, including people in Congress, who will repeat as if it were obvious that the IDF kills Palestinian children on a regular basis. But that comes in with Al-Dura, and it won't go out until the press is willing to acknowledge what kind of a massive failure of professional standards was involved in the circulation of this story and the impact that it had. Because it had a sort of double mythical impact. On the one hand, the impact in the Muslim world was a call to jihad, and that's exactly how bin Laden used it in a video that he came out with shortly after the event and before 9/11. So on the one hand, it was a call to jihad in the Muslim world, and what it was proof that the infidels were targeting, were out to destroy Islam and slaughter Muslims, And anybody who didn't join the jihad against Israel was considered to be complicit. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, in the West, you have this astonishing response, particularly amongst progressives, in which, as one French journalist said very early on, this picture replaces the picture of boy in the Warsaw Ghetto. So, all of a sudden, this picture, 60 seconds of really grainy, shaky, unclear footage, which, when examined closely, disproves all of the narrative surrounding it, becomes a picture and a narrative that replaces one that is symbolic of the deliberate murder of 1.5 million children by the Nazis. So you've got this Holocaust inversion. The Jews are the Israel is the new Nazis, the Palestinians are the new Jews, etc. So in a sense, the reason why this is important is because it lays the groundwork for the current paradigm, which we see increasingly influential, not just in academic circles and not just in journalist circles, but in Congress and in the White House and so on. So, yeah. So, I think it's very important for people to go back and understand how this madness happened, because otherwise you're just, you're like trying to paint on a dirty surface. Unless you clean out that original, what is it? There's a passage in the Lord of the Rings where, if a piece of the sword that wounded you stays in the wound, you can't get healed. And that's exactly it. Al-Dura is a wound to the cognitive and moral orientation of the West. And until it's addressed, I think we're just going to continue losing this war, this cognitive war.
Yeah, that's it is a very important point. And frankly, it really resonates, with anybody with a knowledge of Jewish history back to the era that you were originally studying. Massacres of Jews, say in England, Hugh of Lincoln, blood libels about Jews killing children led to slaughter of Jews in the medieval era and up into the modern era, whenever that, even including in the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. This summer, the Israeli army was forced to return to Jenin to deal with the establishment of a terror base there that, despite the Palestinian Authorities' obligation to eradicate terror, this brings back memories of another blood libel about the IDF in Jenin in 2002 that you wrote about. Again, like with Al-Dura, the lies were debunked, but the media drew no conclusions from that any more than they did with the other case. Yet much of the world is still ready to believe the blood libels against Israel. So I guess, the question for the ordinary reader, the ordinary viewer is, how is that possible, for the same wrong story to be circulated yet again?
Well, again, I got to come back to this idea that somehow people are comforted by news of Jews behaving badly. So for some reason, knowing that Jews behave badly reassures people. To be honest, in my analysis, again, let's go to historical analysis based on my study of millennialism and revolution, which is modern revolution is the secular version of medieval millennialism, this belief that we're going to create a perfect society on earth. The fact is that of all the revolutionary movements, egalitarian revolutionary movements of the 19th and 20th century, most of them, with the exception of the United States, the 18th century, but with the exception of the United States, every egalitarian revolution ended up, particularly if it were under threat from the outside, descending into a sort of cannibalistic terror in which it went after its own people in order, out of a sort of paranoid desire to protect the revolution. Now, Israel wasn't just under threat to the revolutionary government, it was under threat to the entire people. And yet, 75 years later, there's still a democracy, which is literally unheard of in the annals of egalitarian revolutionary movements in modern times. So I think that, one of the things that may deeply bother the left is that as a progressive force, the Jews are far saner and far more humane than the behavior of revolutionary leftists in the past. And by redefining what happened here as a sort of colonial imperialist invasion, they managed to avoid the comparison.
Richard, I think your book is particularly apt because of the insight it brings to the question of anti-Israel media bias. Now, in the not-so-distant past, most of the focus of media monitoring groups that cared about the way Israel was covered was on correcting mistakes and pointing out the ignorance that was behind so much of the slanted coverage of Israel. And they do that, of course, still today, and that's very important. But now, the problem, I think, is something very different, as the contemporary culture of much of the media no longer values objectivity and instead seeks merely to use journalism to advance their pet ideological and partisan agendas. And this takes place all across the board, not just about Israel. But it has a particular impact on Israel. And how does this connect with what you've also written about in terms of anti-Semitism? How does this, destructive media play a part in the rise of anti-Semitism in our own day? And why did that happen?
Well, yeah, I think it's absolutely critical. I don't think that without the media, I don't think that you could have this kind of success to a blood libel, in the sense that this is really the first successful blood libel since the Holocaust. When you were talking about the title of my book, "And the Whole World Be Wrong," it actually comes from Kofi Annan about Jenin in 2002, in which he said, "I don't think the whole world can be wrong," including Israel's friends, meaning all the good liberals who were turning against Israel and saying, "I'm your friend, you're behaving abominably, I must denounce you," including many Jews who, as a Jew, felt they had to do this. So in that sense, I think that what we're dealing with is, ironically, it's the media that has abandoned objectivity, but is still riding on the credentials of being objective that makes this so powerful. In other words, you talk to people, and it's kind of funny because, given the role that postmodernism played in all this, who are talking about the fact that if Israel's killing... That it's a fact that Israel is killing children. I actually once gave a talk in Budapest in 2007, and I used the Al-Dura case as an example of an apocalyptic trigger. And the woman who organized the conference felt called on to interrupt me and say, it's not a myth, it's not a libel. Everybody knows that the IDF kills Palestinian children every day. And I said to her, you just proved the point that I'm making, but it had no impact. So we're dealing with a situation in which, people who are supposed to and claim to be fair and balanced, be objective, to, report the facts as it's really happening, to be honest witnesses to their times, are in fact just pouring Palestinian hate-mongering into the mainstream media. And as a result, they're the ones who are cleaning it up. In other words, if you go on to Palestinian Media Watch or Memory and look at what the Palestinians and other Arab imams are saying, which is really genocidal hatred, that's straight, that makes actually outdoes the Nazis, because we know of no Nazi clerics who are preaching extermination from the pulpit. And we have endless examples of imams from the pulpit calling for the extermination of the Jews worldwide. Now, that couldn't make it in the Western progressive world. But when it gets laundered by the media as a fair narrative of what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians, then, it's got the respectability that it needs.
Well, that's very important. I want to explore also the connections between what to many people are two very different things: the rise of woke ideology and the rise of anti-Semitism. How do these two not just intersect, but feed off of each other?
Right. Well, listen, I mean, I think that woke ideology, and I have a section of the book where I address it. I think that woke ideology is a classic apocalyptic discourse. In other words, the world is filled with evil. That's racism. That's and that evil is to be detected everywhere. There was a great book by Christopher Hale about millenarians in the English Civil War, 1640 to 1660. And, you know, for some of these radical groups, the slightest whiff of hierarchy, the slightest whiff of authority, and it was the Antichrist. And so you really have this sort of discourse in which there's a hypersensitivity to whatever is defined as evil, a complete lack of interest in the problems with your own side, because your own side is in a war against evil and it has to mobilize and it needs its allies. And so if the allies are actually anti-progressive and will completely, you know, they'll eat you up if they win, but they're on your side now and they give you energy, then you side with them. So in the 2003 million people marches in Paris and in London and around the world, you know, the jihadis were welcome guests because they gave lots of energy to it. So you've got this bizarre situation in which you've got an apocalyptic discourse, you know, including the sort of we're in the last generation because of global warming, which is itself an apocalyptic prophecy. You've got this apocalyptic discourse, and for reasons that maybe take too long for us to discuss on this show, but for reasons that are terribly important, what happens is that the left, the progressive left, adopts the apocalyptic narrative of the jihadis, in which the Antichrist is Israel and the United States, the great and little Satan. And as a result, you know, they both agree that at least at this stage, they should be cooperating in bringing down this Antichrist. The Muslim term is Dajjal, and the secular term is the Nazis. You got to bring down this Nazi, white supremacist, racist, imperialist, colonialist world. And, you know, just like the communists in Iran in 1979, if there's a victory for their allies, they're going to get eaten up and spit out.
Richard, I want to play off of your last answer by noting that in your book, one of the interesting angles that you do explore is the way apocalyptic, end of the millennium kinds of thinking in the past that we recognize as a kind of mass insanity if it happened 1,000 years ago, or as you say, during the English Civil War, has repeated itself in our own day, from both in terms of jihadism and progressives who have their own end-of-world scenarios. How does this advance the war against Zionism and the Jews? I mean, how does it happen again? And why are we so slow to recognize, you know, the problem here, and that it is, you know, not really a blood libel, but sort of, you know, kind of thinking that, you know, rational people shouldn't embrace.
Right. So the characteristic of apocalyptic thought, or at least one particular kind of apocalyptic thought, which seems to be that of woke and of critical race theory and so on, is that you know, everything becomes dual. It's either good or it's bad. There's no in the middle. There's a passage in the Apocalypse where the angel of one of the churches says, you know, you were neither hot nor cold, but you were tepid, so I spew you out. And so the apocalyptic mindset is very dualistic. There's good and there's bad. We're the good, unquestionably, and the bad is the people that we're going after and trying to bring down. Now, I think what makes the current 21st century apocalyptic attack on the United States and Israel as sort of the great and little Satan so striking is that in the past, you know, the regimes that the millenarians were trying to bring down were actually really nasty regimes, and their response to being attacked was to destroy their enemies. Their apocalyptic enemies are, is symbolized by the crucifixion of Jesus, who wasn't even a particularly, he wasn't a military enemy, but he was seen as a threat by the Romans. Okay, so on the one hand, you've got this phenomenon of the mindset in the 21st century. The striking thing about the enemy that's being targeted is that it is immensely tolerant of criticism. It doesn't crush the apocalyptic voice. It gives it, in fact, academia has become a home to this kind of progressive apocalypticism, and it allows it to spread through the society. So, in a sense, the regimes that are least logical to attack from the point of view of morality are in fact the most logical to attack from the point of view of the lack of pushback. That means that you can go full throttle and you can continue to go full throttle, and then you can get on the various media made available by this very generous society and complain bitterly that you're being oppressed. And I mean, it's straight out of Monty Python. The whole thing is straight out of Monty Python. Don't you oppress me?
Yeah, very good. One of the opening scenes of Monty Python and the Holy Grail, King Arthur and the socialist peasant. Look at the violence inherent in the regime.
Right. You're right. Exactly.
Well, Richard, you've mapped out a set of daunting problems facing Israel and the Jews. And these are very serious problems, and they're growing worse. So I guess the question is, are you optimistic about the fight against these formidable factors that are fueling anti-Semitism?
Well, look, let me put it this way. First of all, we're faced with a fantastic challenge. I mean, the conditions in the history of millennial movements, the only way that they sort of expend themselves, or the only way they end up until now, is either been they take power and sort of expend themselves on an orgy of megadeath, like the Soviets or the Nazis and so on, or they get crushed before they take power. What we're looking at is a society that is an open society that allows dissent to a very extreme level. I mean, the kind of dissent that's allowed in the West would never be allowed in, say, Muslim society. So on the one hand, so what we're faced with is a really incredible challenge, which is, can we actually culturally create a movement that will counter this apocalyptic, very destructive and self-destructive apocalyptic discourse, can counter it successfully, non-violently, without the use of violence. And, it's a great challenge. I'm glad to be alive to be able to fight it. But I can't say that, if I were looking from the outside in, I'd say you're up against some pretty severe odds. We're up against some pretty severe odds in trying to wean people, on the one hand, off of their anti-Semitism, or, as I put it, the sort of moral schadenfreude, the thrill that they get from stories of Jews behaving badly, on the one hand, and on the other hand, from allowing themselves to be bullied by literally apocalyptic warriors who are out to destroy the very values that these people claim, progressives claim that they represent and want to see flourish.
Yes, well, the fight is formidable, but we're obligated to keep pushing back, and we're not giving up. Richard, thanks so much for joining us today and for your really fascinating insights on these terrible problems. I do recommend that our viewers and listeners read Can the Whole World Be Wrong? It's an important book. And we also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition. And whether you're listening to us on Apple, Google Play, Spotify, or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to Top Story, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.